Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a video for you talking about some of my priorities that I have when I'm buying a pocket knife. First off, though, I want to thank, of course, my Patreon patrons who make the entire channel possible. I also want to thank very specifically a patron named Jim M, who actually sent me a message on Patreon saying, "Hey Nick, I realize that every person will have different priorities, everybody does, but I'm curious in what order you would prioritize the following factors when looking at a knife for your personal collection." And he gives the factors ergonomics, materials, aesthetics, deployment, performance of action, and fit and finish. Thing is, Jim, that's a really good question, and I think it's an interesting sort of, it's a way to explore the collecting priorities and the things I look for in a pocket knife in a different way than I have before. But because I'm a little bit of a diva, I'm going to break it up slightly differently, and I'm going to rank from the lowest priority to the highest priority. And you dig in the on-screen graphics here. This is some fancy stuff right here. We're going to talk about safety. We're going to talk about the action of a pocket knife. We'll talk about aesthetics. We'll talk about the blade, fit and finish. We'll talk about lock type, deployment type, handle materials, and ergonomics. And I'm going to talk about where all of these guys fall in my sort of priority list as I'm thinking about purchasing a pocket knife. And I've got my knife box right here next to me, so I can pull out examples as things go along. So anyways, I'm going ahead and buckle in. We're going to go through the list here. And one thing to be very clear about is that I'm talking about this from the perspective of myself, me as a collector, right? There are going to, of course, be different choices that each of you are going to make. You're going to prioritize things differently. And if you rank things differently, do let me know kind of in the comments. You know, how does your world differ? But I'm going to talk about what's most important to me and give some of my own preferences, which are kind of like opinions in that it's difficult for them to be wrong. You can just disagree with them. But anyways, that's what I'm going to talk about today. And in no particular order, we're going to just go ahead and jump in, and we'll start off with ergonomics. So ergonomics to me is, well, it kind of means two different things, right? You're going to have pocket knives that are just intensely ergonomic, that work really well in the hand. The TRM Atom is a pretty good example of a good ergonomic pocket knife. Another one would be, the Spyderco Pm2, which again, for a lot of people is a very, very ergonomic knife. But the thing is, the ergonomics of holding a pocket knife are very different than the ergonomics of deploying it and of carrying it, right? There are knives that are very, very nice in the hand, but very, very difficult to get into your hand because the ergonomics. So we're going to kind of put some of that stuff off into the action and to deployment and things like that. But the thing is, I feel like it is very possible for a pocket knife to kind of get away with a less than ideal ergonomic in the hand if it is something that is very, very great for carrying. Particularly there are, and I'm trying to think of a good example of something like this, but let's see. They don't tend to stick around if they're not at least a little bit ergonomic. But, you know, recently I did a review of the Crkt CEO Compact, which is an interesting little knife, but it's not super ergonomic in the hand. But the thing is, it's small. It carries really, really well. And I think for most people, that's not going to be something they're using day in, day out. It'll be in the pocket for 12 hours and in the hand for a minute or two a day, maybe. So there are definitely going to be days where that's a higher priority, where I might reach for something that I know is going to be super duper ergonomic. But at the same time, for most of the time, it's just kind of a spoiler. If something's got the ergonomics of a bag of pottery shards, it's probably not going to be great. But at the same time, I think in most cases, ergonomics actually ranks, it's important, but it's not the only important thing, right? There are more importances, yeah, that's a term, out there in the world these days. So, to me, that's where ergonomics lands. It's it can be important, but it's mostly just a spoiler. If it's done really bad, that can break something down. Next up, let's talk a little bit about the idea of the blade. And I want to be very, very clear about this. This says blade. This does not say blade steel, because it is about way more than just steel. Blade, a good blade means a bunch of things. Of course, if you have a complete garbage steel, you're going to have probably a complete garbage knife. But at the same time, this means good steel chemistry, but it also means good edge geometry. It means good heat treatment, right? And the thing is, I talk a big game about blades because that is kind of a knife's one job. A pocket knife is meant to be a tool that you use for cutting, and the main part of the tool that does that is the blade itself. And so if your blade is utter garbage, you've got a problem here. And this is not a place where makers should cut corners, right? There are makers out there in the world, especially in the budget end, who are going to use really bad steels with very poor soft heat treats, but they do great prices, and it's like, dude, that's the one thing you should have been doing. But I want to be, again, clear that geometry and heat treat are the key, right? If those two things are screwed up, then the knife is dead on arrival, no matter what it says on the blade here. You know, you get really nice steels out there, like your 20CV, like your Magna Cut, like this little guy right here. But if it's not heat treated well, and both of those are, by the way, then it's all for naught, so to speak. The other thing that's important to think about is the edge geometry, right? If you have a knife that is super duper thick behind the edge, and an example of this, I like the Alembic Busker a lot, but this particular version is relatively thick behind the edge, right? It doesn't come down to a particularly acute point back there. There are definitely knives out there that are a lot worse with it, but it means that it is sharp and it can cut, but it just doesn't cut as effectively as something that is, oh, come here, that is super duper thin behind the edge and comes down to a super duper acute edge. This is just going to cut a world better than something that is thicker there. So for me, knives that are super thick behind the edge, or knives that are badly treated or with a soft steel, they just don't get carried. They don't stay around in my collection. It's also tough to me when the blade stock is super duper thick, right? And to be fair, I have some knives with stock that is super duper thick. This is an example of that. This is the Demko Knives 8020, and it's ground reasonably well. It could be a little bit thinner, but the stock here is very thick, and as a result, I know it's an aesthetic. Overbuilt is definitely a thing. This is the Demko Knives 8020, TRM Atom, by the way, Spyderco Pm2, and tactile Rockwell thumb stud. And this would be the Overland by TJ Schwartz. Anyways, if it is super, super thick blade stock, that means that it's not going to be great for cutting into hard, cutting into hard things like, for instance, an apple, a closed cell foam, or something like that. And I know people are like, Nick, it works fine, it cuts. Yeah, I know, but it works better if the blade stock is thinner, right? So that's an aesthetic. It's a fad, but you know what? For me, it's kind of a deal breaker, right? This is about as thick as I'm willing to go, and even still, I'm only going there because this is sort of unique in a bunch of other ways, and it still comes down to a relatively thin edge. I'm loving the trend that I'm seeing in the industry of moving towards very, very thin and slicey blades. It just makes better knives. But anyways, so all of that is there, and geometry and heat treat are in a lot of ways much more important than the chemistry of the steel. You can do a great steel chemistry very, very badly, so just seeing M390 on the blade doesn't mean a whole lot if they're not backing it up with great treatment of it. But nonetheless, as for the blade steel itself, if you watch my blade steel video, what's my very favorite blade steel, you're going to see that there are broad classes of steels there, right? I have my steels of choice that I really, really like seeing. And by the way, I want to say MagnaCut has made its way into there. I've now had a couple of different knives in MagnaCut, and I am very, very impressed with it. It is a very high-quality steel. But anyways, the steels of choice are great, right? And also I have my good-to-go kind of steels, right? And those are fine, too. If a knife is presented to me, so to speak, if I see something new, come up on the Blade HQ or whatever, and it's got one of those steels, I'm fine with it. It's good to go. It's fine. So at some level, this could be two very different things, right? The blade needs to be done well. Right, the blade is very, very important. A knife that doesn't cut well is a bad knife, by definition. But the actual blade steel is actually a little bit less important than it is the heat treatment, than it is the quality with which it's treated, with the geometry. All of those things are more important. So don't be one of those people who just looks at the chemistry and says that tells the entire story, but instead look at the blade holistically. Can it cut? Can it hold an edge well? Is it done well enough that it's not going to be super brittle? There's a whole lot to it. But blade is important, 100%, but it's not just the steel. So I want to be clear about that. Handle material. Next, in no particular order. Look, I've got some aesthetic preferences out there, but I like a lot of stuff, right? I am definitely I'm a big fan of a good old-fashioned, titanium handle, like on this Oz Roosevelt here. It's a really nice material. I do love me some carbon fiber. This is the Monterey Bay Knives EWC. Really nice. I like some micarta, like on the Schwartz Overland that's already on the table here. And I definitely, Timascus and all kinds of other fancy stuff, Yeah, I'm not going to object to that either. I am a little bit bougie on occasion in my collecting. That's a thing. But at the same time, and there are definitely negative aesthetic things for me. Like Carbo Quartz was a fad for a little while there, and it really looks like somebody found countertop cutoffs and found the marketing strategy. I was quite happy to see that fad disappear. And I got to say, the more, colors that you put into carbon fiber, the less I care for it, right? This is an example of, I think, a very subtle carbon fiber with some colors. This is the Knife Nuts Podcast Edition Tempest by Shop by Design. Really, really nice knife. And you can see it's got a little tiny bit of purple in there, but it's not cloying, right? You just kind of notice it if you're looking, but mostly it's a marbled carbon fiber. Like, that kind of thing is okay with me. But there are handle materials. So by and large, though, most handle materials, if you're doing it well, I'm okay with it, right? But there are things that are deal breakers, right? No micarta is better than bad micarta. There have been some companies out there, particularly overseas, who have recently, found that micarta sells knives and have then started doing like, oh, wow, here we've got micarta. And really, it's just resin that they dragged a piece of cloth over at one point in time. Looks really ugly. Dude, if you're going to do micarta, do good micarta. Otherwise, just skip it overall. Like, this is really good micarta. This is a Pena front flipper trapper here. Looks really nice, but crappy micarta does not look good enough, right? The other thing that is absolutely dead on arrival for me are steel frame locks. And I think I've got an example of one of those around here somewhere. Yeah, right here. This is a steel frame lock from Crkt, and this is a very, very inexpensive knife, which is the only way that this sticks around enough to even be something I keep around as an example. The thing is, frame locks, that is where the actual lock bar is cut out of the frame of the knife. This is another example of one in titanium. They work great in titanium. They make sense weight-wise, and they lead to a kind of a cool construction, right? Titanium frame locks are a major force in the industry. But steel, honestly, no. I mean, frame locks are not strictly better than liner locks. And in a lot of cases, if you're just going to make it out of steel, you're better off just making it a liner lock there and calling it a day, right? It's going to be thinner, it's going to be lighter, etc. If you're going to do it in steel, do it as a liner lock. I don't see steel frame locks as being useful. And so for me, it had better be really, really, really cheap. And even then, I'm not going to be a big fan of it. It's probably not going to carry. So that's a deal breaker. The other thing that can be a deal breaker for me is if I feel like I'm going to break the thing, right? I'm a big fan of the Benchmade bug out pattern. Like, for instance, here it is with a pair of titanium scales, but the original scales in the plastic did not do it for me. They just felt very fragile. I know that in practice, if you're not doing abusive cutting, it's going to be fine. But at the same time, for me, the bug out was a knife I never loved until I tried it with a pair of better scales, and I realized, wow, this is a really great pattern, even if the original plastic wasn't doing it for me. So, for me, even if it's not a real deal, it starts to hurt my trust in the tool a little bit. If I can, like, pinch it shut, that's not doing it for me. So, those are kind of the deal breakers for me. But for the most part, it is just aesthetics. It's not a huge factor. As long as you're doing handle material well, I really don't care exactly how you're doing it. There are lots of really good ways to go about doing that with a pocket knife. Aesthetics is going to be our next thing. And honestly, this is big, right? I am a collector of knives because, in a lot of ways, I view them as functional art, right? And in many cases, they are just outright art. This is a this is the ProTech Knives Ultimate Custom Sprint. This is engraved by Bruce Shaw, who is an actual master engraver. It has mother of pearl inlays. This is an absolutely beautiful knife. Or another example of a very different kind of art would be this Holt Blade Works Spectre here with the beautiful Damasteel overlays. I just find that these are beautiful, right? They're beautiful in many, many different ways, right? There are lots of ways that you can be pretty as a pocket knife, right? For instance, I'll give you an example here. This is the Grimsom Knives Norseman, and this is a knife that I find aesthetically attractive, mostly in its construction. That sounds sort of disingenuous, but it shows a very, very strong mastery of machining. It shows a lot of really cool, frankly, it's a very interesting story. There's a lot of aesthetic joy here that is not necessarily the actual direct look of the knife, which I know is very controversial for a lot of people. But for me, all of those elements can be a part of aesthetic, right? And it's a part of the reason why I would find the knife compelling in some way. So whether it's actual direct physical aesthetics, whether it shows a mastery of machining, or whether there's an incredible functional beauty to it. I got to be real with you. The shark lock here on the Demco Knives 8020 is absolutely a beautiful thing. It is gorgeous in the sense of just how effective it is. It is a really, really nice locking mechanism. And in its functional simplicity, I see beauty there. So knives are both art and tools to me. And to survive in my collection, I find that generally you need something that feels artistic. Whether it's a classical sense or a different, more functional sense. And I got to say, too, that beautiful aesthetics, beautiful design, all of those things can overcome a number of functional other issues, right? There are definitely knives out there in the world, especially in the budget end, which are, on paper, for instance, they might have a lesser grade of steel, or they might be a little bit more expensive, but they've got a really nice design, or a really great designer. I mean, okay, for instance, an example of this would be the Civivi McKenna here. This is an Elijah Isham design. Absolutely a beautiful, beautiful knife, but in practice, it's a much sort of lower end. That's a dumb thing to say, but at the same time, this is a much more budget-friendly item that lives in my collection, and I carry with pride, right? It's a 154 cm blade steel on here, which is not, a top-of-the-line, oh my God, sort of blade steel. It's budget-friendly. It's a brass liner, but it's still beautiful enough, and it's just done well enough that, I really don't care. So the aesthetics still sneak in there. And to me, it can also be a deal-breaker, right? So much of the budget stuff out there has no aesthetic interest at all. It doesn't look different. It isn't interesting. It doesn't look, there's no mastery to it. I don't really care what else you're doing at that point, right? If you're making something that is completely uninteresting at $40, I'm not really interested in spending $40 on it. The market is so the market is so competitive that you need to be compelling, right? The market is too full of good designs to even consider boring ones. So I'll say aesthetics is not certainly the top of the pile, but it is definitely way up there for me. I would rank that very highly because it's able to overcome, for instance, lesser materials, or it's able to overcome other kinds of issues if something is sufficiently beautiful and if something is sufficiently different and interesting. That's the kind of thing that can get that out there for me. Next up on the ranking here would be deployment type. So deployment type for me actually matters a little bit less than you think, and by that I mean, for instance, there are knives with thumb studs like this guy. There are knives with this is a top flipper. This is the Monterey Bay WC. There are knives with opening holes like the Roosevelt here, and there are knives that are front flippers like this little Isham here, right? Pop that guy open. You're opening that in a very, very different way. And, of course, you got your good old-fashioned classical flippers with the pocket pecker hanging off the back. Press that, open the blade, and you get your automatics, right? Where you press the button, kaboom, goes open. There are all kinds of different ways to open a knife, right? And to me, this isn't that important, right? Because I love me some flippers. I love me some thumb studs, some front flippers, some opening holes, some autos. It's all good. Autos do have legal constraints, which limit my EDC choices some. Living in the state of California, we have a very, very dumb law that says that any auto over 2 inches is, oh my God, dangerous, because for some damn reason. But anyway, so that limits my ability to carry a bigger auto. That's a problem. And honestly, I'm a little bit less interested in front flippers than some of the others. They're just not as quick to deploy, right? Functionally, they can be really cool, but it's just not something like if somebody says, oh, hey, cool, what should I do? Should I do a front flip? At this point in time in my life, and this is maybe an area where I've changed my view a little bit, they're just not as interesting to me in the grand scheme of things. They're great. I'll probably buy more front flippers. Heck, I just bought a new front flipper recently, but at the same time, it's probably not my favorite mechanism, but it's still fine. There are only really two kinds of deployment that I just can't get myself behind, right? The big ones for me are nail nick only style knives, like your Swiss Army knife style things, where I don't keep long nails generally, and it just feels like a really unpleasant way to go about things. And then thumb discs, which I have no examples of. And this is where you have a little disc that is mounted on top of the blade like this, that you then use effectively as a thumb stud, except it's worse than a thumb stud because it blocks the cutting path and it doesn't feel as good on the finger. I don't get why thumb discs ever existed and don't think they ever should, right? I mean, whatever, that's my own personal opinion, but I've never met a thumb disc I like. And so to me, those are kind of the deal breakers for me. If your knife is nail nick only, I'm probably not interested. You at least need to give me like the ability to get in there and pinch it open if it's a nail nick style knife. And if it's a thumb disc, it's dead in the water for me. That's just not a method I appreciate. It's just like thumb studs, but make it worse. So for me, deployment type is actually not super interesting. I would even go so far as to put it below handle material. There are lots of good options out there. The action of the pocket knife, that's the next one to bring up. And look, to be very clear, this is big, but it's not the biggest one. There are lots of different actions in the world, right? This is a very drop-shot knife. The Grimsom Norseman here is sort of the epitome of a drop-shot pocket knife. If you give it any ability to do so, it will just guillotine close. That's beautiful, and it's a way of showing machining mastery. But it's not the only way to go about things, right? There are lots of knives out there which have a very smooth, glassy close. This is the Alembic Wayfarer 247, and this is a knife, and Alembic, generally speaking, it's not like drop shutty, right? If I'm doing this, it's not closing, but it is very, very smooth. It's very glassy. It's like you're putting two panes of glass against each other, well lubricated. It's a very, very nice, smooth close. It's very easy to do, very easy to close, but it's very different. It's not drop shutty. And of course, I can still get behind a nice, slow hydraulic opening along the lines of your Chris Reeve knives, Shabazz, where it is very, very smooth throughout the process, but it is a very slow process. Like I said, it's very hydraulic. I'm open to any of these things, and there are lots of different ways to do good action. As long as it deploys reliably, and as long as it's got that smoothness and zero play, of course, it's totally fine. You know, and I'm even potentially open to an assisted knife. Here's an example of an assisted knife where once you get past a certain point, the blade itself actually, there's a spring in there that takes over and fires it out a little bit. I generally don't go there, and I generally recommend against them because a good manual action does just as good at deploying the blade, but it's just way easier to close and, frankly, nicer. I've usually viewed it as kind of a hack to compensate for a poor action otherwise. But the thing is, if the right knife comes along with an assist, yeah, sure, why not? It's not a complete deal breaker. The thing that I cannot do and that I will not abide is a bad action. And by bad, I mean a number of different things. It could be a knife that is super gritty. And by the way, this is not an example, but I'm just going to use this as I'm showing this. This is a super smooth, very, very glassy, drop shutty sort of action. This is a great action. But instead, you can have a knife that is super gritty. As you're kind of pulling it open, it's like very, very, very slow, and like you feel the detent ball just going across, it's going through it in there, right? It could be a very inconsistent action where there's a lot of effort required to get this far and then very little effort, then it effortfuls up again, where it feels like things are pinching in there, which is not great. You can get a super stick slippy action where it's like as you're going there, it's like very easy and then whoop, went out and then whoop, and you know, as you're going through, it's just like slowly opening in a series of sticks and slips, and I just hate that. That's often an issue with Teflon or Nylotron washers. Certainly people can do them well, but in my experience, they generally don't. And I'll be honest, the Teflon washers bother me at a very real, it's aesthetic level, right? You're making the core of your knife plastic, really? Is that how you're doing it? I get it. They work okay. But generally speaking, they produce an action that's not great for me. There were like one or two makers who I've ever seen do an action that I found acceptable on Teflon. And to me, I'm a snob, but whatever. Anyways, another option is it could have blade play at the kind of tightening. And by blade play, by the way, I mean, for instance, if you kind of shake the blade like this, the blade shouldn't be wobbling back and forth in your hand, and certainly it shouldn't be doing it on this direction here, right? But that's blade play, and if the knife needs to have blade play in order to be able to freely open and close, that's a bad knife, right? You want to never have blade play. That's not a great thing. Some people are like, oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah, that's because you have low standards. To me, if you have that can be problematic. Other issues that could come up are having a detent that is too hard, meaning that and by the way, let me find something that would, this is not a detent that is too hard, but where you press, you can't get it to fire, and then eventually, okay, it fires. Or you can have detents that are too soft, where it just kind of flips out there. And again, this is actually a very hard detent, but where you like press the flipper and it's just like, oh, and this is so smooth that it just kind of worked its way open. But if the detent is too soft, it actually becomes dangerous because the knife could open in your pocket very reliably. So, you know, to me, those are the kinds of things that are problematic. A gritty action, an inconsistent, a stick slippy action, or if you have to have blade play, if your detent's too hard so you can't hardly open it, or too soft so you open it all the time, even when you don't mean to. Those are complete deal breakers. Those bad actions are deal breakers, but what kind of good action it has, whether it's drop shutty, whether it's, you know, very glassy, or whether it's hydraulic, that doesn't matter as much to me. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put it in the middle of the pack, right? A bad action can kill the knife, 100%. If you have a crappy detent, the knife is done for. That's a safety issue outright. But at the same time, what exactly the nature of the good action isn't quite as important to me as some of the other things out there. Next up is fit and finish. Now, fit and finish matters, right? This is big. I have a whole article on Knife News from back in the day when I was doing some writing for them about why fit and finish matters. I make the argument because, you know, some makers have made the argument, oh, why does it matter if it's exactly on center? It's a tool. It's meant to be high speed, low drag. and they go crazy with it, right? But thing is, if I am paying more than 40 bucks for a knife, it needs to be done right, period, right? And even at that point, it's like the competition's doing it right, guys. Get with the program here. And particularly when we go north of like 100 bucks, there is just zero excuse for poor centering. There is zero excuse for inconsistent grinds. And by the way, by poor centering, I mean, here we go. This is a knife with poor centering. It's the Spyderco Indela, which is unfortunately north of 100 bucks. But this is a blade. The blade is sitting in the knife off center. Does this matter for day-to-day use? No, it doesn't. But at the same time, you had one job, right? This is a thing that you need to be getting right. Right? There is no excuse for inconsistent grinds where one side of the knife is ground very differently than the other side. Or maybe the grind starts up. And by the way, by the grind, I mean this little line kind of here. If it were to start over here on this side and start back here on the other side, that's not particularly great, right? Or if there's blade play, or if there are gaps in the back here, this is meant to, by the way, there's a pull down there. But, you know, for instance, here's a nice example of, this is actually two pieces of metal, but you can't tell because there's no gaps. It's done well, right? But those kinds of things, just, or wobbly bits, those issues shouldn't be a thing over 100 bucks. I'm sorry, no. And certainly, every maker has occasional quality control slip-ups, right? But the good makers will make it right without hesitation. You message them, say, hey, my knife's off center. They're going to be like, oh, damn, I'm sorry about that. Here, send it back in. We'll get you one that works. Or, hey, mine's got blade play. Oh, damn, that should not have left the factory. Let me help you out here. But I look at some of the makers out there who regularly and unashamedly ship knives with poor fit and finish and play it off like it's an expected issue or it's within spec. Like, no, guys, that's freaking terrible. Do you have no pride in your work? Do you just not care? You giving up? What's up with that? It's sad. So anyways, I think everybody should be giving good fit and finish because, to be fair, a lot of the competition is now. The bar has been raising and raising and raising. And I think some people may not have seen the bar raise, but it is really, really important. And if the value is maybe completely out of this world, then okay, I'm willing to put up with some centering issues, right? That's not a big problem. But still, the value needs to be completely wild in order for that to be a thing. So for me, if I'm buying a fancy knife, and I mean anything north of 100 bucks, fit and finish matters. The social contract of paying 100 bucks for a knife means you need to do it right. And if you screw it up, you need to make it right. And if the maker refuses that, then it's absolutely over. And so for me, I'm going to go on ahead and say that fit and finish is pretty high up there. If the blade is bad, that's still worse to me. And aesthetics is the reason I'm interested in the piece to start with. I got too damn many knives, so that's why I've got this ranking here. Fit and finish matters, though. Lock type. There are a billion different ways to lock and unlock a knife. This is an example of an axis lock, a sliding bar style lock, where this little bar needs to slide back and forth to lock and unlock the knife. This here Oz Machine Company is an example of a frame lock. This little bit of the frame goes in there, right? And by the way, knife folks, I know you know this, but I'm letting people know, who might not be in there. This is a liner lock, where there is a little piece of liner here, which is able to lock the blade shut there. What else do we have here? We've got a weird one in the Demco Shark Lock, which uses this little guy in the back here to lock and unlock the blade. Really, really cool thing. What are the locking mechanisms have I missed? Oh, yeah, this is a button lock right here. There's a button here. When you press the button, it unlocks. I think technically makes it a button unlock, but I'm not going to, drag him for it. And there were lots of other ones out there. Like this is a back lock right here, where you've got a little lock on the back of it. You press that down, blade unlocks. And then, of course, you've got yourself non-locking knives, like this little slip joint from Serge Panchenko, right? This is a slip joint. This is a knife that does not lock. Similarly, this is the Monterey Bay EWC, which is a non-locking knife. There is no lock at all on this, but because it's well-designed, it's got this little area here. It's, not going to really come closed on your hand, which is a beautiful thing. But to me, okay, I'm generally a little less interested in non-locking knives. They're hard to do very well with that kind of safety feature like I just showed you. And they're, frankly, just getting the pull right, getting the amount of force required to close the blade again, that's a difficult thing. And the thing is, locks on knives are a safety feature, more than anything else. Some lawmakers, oh my God, it locks, murder machine. No, dude, it just makes it safer for the person using the pocket knife on a daily basis as a part of their life, right? So locks to me are a bonus, and you need to work a little harder to be a slip joint that I love in my life. You need to have a really good safe action. You need to have a strong spring, or you need to be doing things right in other ways that make the knife safe to carry. So slip joints and non-locking knives are less interesting to me, but they're still in there. But in practice, All modern locks that are implemented well are equivalently safe for normal use. There are going to be people who are, presumably, oh my God, triad lock, that's the thing. Oh, there's a whole group of fanboys of particular lock designs, and this is one of them that has a particular fandom to it, but who believe that only this one is the strongest, or only the shark lock is the strongest. The thing is, that doesn't matter for most people, right? For most daily use, in fact, I would say all daily use, anything else is abusive, any of these locks will perform well if they are done well, if they are made to spec, right? And if I absolutely need a knife that will stand up to abusive use, guess what I'm going to use? A damn fixed blade, because then the lock is guaranteed not to fail, because there's no lock. It's just a piece of solid freaking metal, and if you've failed your solid piece of freaking metal, you've got yourself a bigger problem than your locking mechanism. So I definitely, I don't care that much about which exact mechanism is being used. Oh, I forgot to mention the compression lock, which is kind of like a liner lock, but backwards. Very well known by Spyderco. Also, absolutely good to go. You're going to see a lot of titanium frame locks in my collection, right? They're out there, certainly. And the thing is, they've been kind of a fad for a little while, but they're not like the best by any long shot. These days, frankly, liner and bolster locks are just as welcome. A bolster lock being where there's kind of a frame lock, but it's underneath another piece. Where's that hole at? Here's another example of a bolster lock. It's a frame lock technically, but it's hiding under a different piece there. So that way you're not putting any pressure on the lock bar as you're deploying the knife. It's an absolutely beautiful thing. And the thing is, I'm always interested in new locks that solve the problem and offer a great user experience. The shock lock is a great example of this. This is a brand new lock that is fundamentally great. I'm a big fan of this locking mechanism, and I want to see it on more and more stuff. Demco did great work there. And of course, if a locking knife does not lock, that's a major safety issue, and that's a whole different thing. But to me, the actual lock type that you're going to be using on a regular basis is not that damn important to me. Any of them are okay, by and large, any of the modern versions, and if you're doing it wrong, well, it's a safety issue rather than otherwise. And that actually brings up the last one I want to talk about here today. And of course, there were plenty of others I could have put in there. Size is important, but for me, it's kind of weird, right? You have to be really good to be really big or really small, but for the most part, I tend to focus around like 3.5 inch sort of blade lengths, because that's what works best in my daily life. But anyways, and of course, there are plenty of others. Let me know what you prioritize that I forgot here today. But the biggest issue for me of all, frankly, is safety, right? That is a really important thing. And this one goes, I'll go ahead and spoil it right at the freaking top. Because this is, there is no way that an unsafe knife will stay in my collection. There's no way that I'll even carry it, right? That would be a major freaking problem. An unsafe knife can do every other one of these things right. It can be beautiful with a great blade. It can have great fit and finish, great ergonomics, and action that's unbelievable, great handle material, great lockup, great deployment, and if it's unsafe, I still don't care. It goes in the garbage, right? It is a bad freaking knife. And there are lots of ways that a knife can be unsafe. Luckily, it doesn't happen that often, but one thing that can happen is when you get a knife with a bad lockup, where, for instance, and again, this isn't an example, this is the Ferrum Forged Stinger, but this is a perfectly fine lockup, but where, for instance, if you apply pressure on the closed or on the open knife, it just closes, right? The lock moves over and it closes, where the lock fails, basically, where it's able to close even though the knife is locked. That's a big freaking problem, right? And that is more dangerous to me than a non-locking knife, because at least with a slip joint, you kind of know, like there are certain angles that I really can't take. I should be careful here, as opposed to with a locking knife, if you think it's locked and it actually isn't, you have a major problem there. That is a big issue, right? Also, bad detents can be a major safety issue, right? If you have a detent that is so overwhelmingly weak, and this is not an example of it again, but where it can absolutely just kind of shake open in your pocket, right? If you do this and the blade comes flying out, that could well stab you in the leg. That's a major safety issue, right? And similarly, another issue is, for instance, if we look at this ProTech Sprint here, what we see is that the actual button that you press to deploy the thing is recessed down underneath there. That's important, right? If the button is sticking way far up above this means it's very easy to accidentally press that button. And when you accidentally press that button, you suddenly have a blade out. And that's not good. I just cut my table a little bit. Nice. Anyways, that was unsafe. But if you press that button accidentally and then the blade deploys, you got a big problem, right? So having the blade, the button recessed here is important. And I've seen lots of button locks come out lately, especially from companies new to button locks who haven't figured that out yet. Where it's like the button's sticking up all the way out here and you're just like, oh, that's gonna do someone in someday. And of course, one of the ones that gets out most often, I mean, goes out into the world, is when the blade is able to cut you when it is closed. This very often happens when a company is using very thick blade stock and they're trying to make a very slim knife. This is not an example of where that happens, but you can see here that the edge of the blade is right kind of down in this area. And this knife keeps the edge of the blade very far away. So I can run my finger along here and I can even kind of put it horizontally in there and I'm not able to touch the blade. But I have definitely seen blades where it is right up even with the side of that. And that means as you reach past this guy with your finger, you are going to cut your finger open, right? This is not a good thing. I've even seen knives where it sticks slightly past out. And that's just like, oh my God, no. That is terrible. And there is just no excuse for a bad lockup or a bad detent, like a criminally bad detent, where it is just like flopping in the breeze. Or a blade that cuts you will close to leave the factory. By the way, the cutting will close can also occur at the tip of the blade. And again, that's not here. But if the tip is just sitting right up here, that's kind of a problem, right? You could catch your finger on the tip of that, cut yourself open. It's no good. So to me, safety is the most important because this kills the knife, right? If it's not a safe knife, I will not carry it. If it could cut me well closed, I will not carry it. There is no amount of aesthetics. There is no amount of blade or fit and finish that makes it worth risking some part of, even a little tiny part of my health. So to me, this is ultimately sort of my ranking here. And I feel pretty good about it, right? I feel like this actually captures things pretty well. And it's kind of fun. I didn't know exactly what I was going to rank these before I started here. But, you know, this pretty much captures it, right? Other people are going to put these differently, right? If you are using your knife all day, every day, then aesthetics might actually fall lower down to the bottom and you're going to end up with blade and ergonomics way towards the top there, right? That could be very important. If you're doing something that requires you to use a folding knife and you need something super durable for some reason, Loctite might get more important for you. Or perhaps if you have some kind of a physical disability that makes it more difficult for you to deploy something in a certain way, you might rank deployment type way up there higher, right? I think safety always needs to be pretty up there, and if you don't care about the blade, then you're probably in the wrong hobby, right? Just get into watches. Do not get into watches. But nonetheless, I think everybody is going to have different rankings for this. And like I said, let me know what your ranking is down below and why. More importantly, just give me a list. That's great. But tell me what changed. What's different about your life? But at least for me, the ranking I just showed you there is where I ended up landing. And I hope you found this interesting, right? And I hope it sparked some discussion for you. And I hope, for the very least, some maker looks at it and goes, huh, interesting. You know, the blade on this new prototype cuts you when it's closed. That's probably not good. We should address that. Right? It's out there. Anyways, so there you go. Hope this has been interesting to you, that you had less trauma from this video than my Matt did here, and that you have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.